Let me repeat that one more time. Okay. So for folks, thank you for joining us for today's research seminar. My name is Chung Chung. I'm the academic program manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, Oregon. I'll be your host for today's talk, as well as Lisa Balance, Dr. Lisa Balance. This is a hybrid event with folks attending both on-site and online. Sabina is our hybrid support today, so please let her know if you're having any technical issues so she can assist, or let those of us on site know. For those of you online, we have your mics, camera, and screen share off, but please ask any questions you might have using the chat at any time, and we'll answer any questions at the end of this talk. If you put a question in chat, we will read it out for everyone in the audience here in person as well. You're also welcome to raise your digital hand at the end of today's talk, and we will be letting you know when it's your turn, and we'll help to unmute your mic. For those of you in the room, if you have not already, please make sure you sign in. We'll be handling questions today at the end of the talk. If you have a question, please raise your hand in here, and I will bring you this mic so you can ask that question so that those folks online can hear. We'll be recording this event, and it will be posted on the HMSC past seminar page in a few days, and that is on our website. A couple of announcements before we get started. Please join us next week for our research seminar hosted by research seminar here at the Marine Science Center, Thursday, August 3rd at 3:30 p.m. When Hui Radomski from the South Coast Regional who's the South Coast Regional Representative of the Oregon Coast Management Program and the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, where she will share with us an update on the Oregon Coastal Management Plan. So let me introduce you to Dr. Lisa Balance, Director of the Marine Mammal Institute, who will introduce today's speaker. Lisa.
All right, I'm going to do a sound check, Sabina, for online folks. Good. Right, thank you, Chung. Good afternoon and welcome to all of you here in person and online. This afternoon, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our seminar speaker, Dr. Tara Whitty. If I were constrained to a one-sentence introduction, it would be this. Tara's interests, projects, and passions defy categorization. Fortunately, I have time for a few more sentences. So let me take a couple of minutes right now to give you some background about Dr. Whitty. Tara obtained her Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and her Master of Science and doctorate degrees from Scripps Institution of Oceanography in Biological Oceanography. She has a very long list of prizes and awards, including those from the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Fulbright Program, the National Geographic Society, the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission, and the Society of Marine Mammalogy. She founded Scripps Institution of Oceanography's Small Scale and Artisanal Fisheries Research Network, and she's been a collaborator on Too Big to Ignore, a global partnership for small-scale fisheries research. And she did all of that before she obtained her PhD. As a doctorate student, she wanted to study marine mammals, but the more she delved into dissertation possibilities, the more she recognized that she wanted to save marine mammals. She wanted to have her research contribute to effective management and, where needed, to conservation. Fairly quickly, she learned that to do this, she needed to study humans. And she learned that doing that was and continues to be challenging. Often the results are lessons learned through failures rather than through successes. You'll see this theme a lot during the next hour. Since obtaining her PhD, she has worked with IUCN, Conservation International, and World Wildlife Fund, to name 3 globally active organizations, as well as many smaller scale, more regionally focused nonprofits, local agencies, and groups, mostly in Southeast Asia, but many countries. Her work is primarily focused on bycatch of marine megafauna in small-scale fisheries, but her work has also broadened to explore pathways by which conservation efforts succeed or fail, and the role of inclusion, conflict, and other human interactions in those pathways. She recently founded Conservation Realist, a podcast and newsletter that shares unsung voices and ideas on how conservation must and can improve. That podcast and newsletter, they are insightful, innovative, transdisciplinary, and deep food for thought. I highly recommend it. I was Tara's PhD advisor, I'm proud to say. Yet I can unequivocally say that Tara has taught me more than I taught her, and she continues to do so. Pending final approval, the Marine Mammal Institute will be rolling out a new graduate certificate in marine mammalogy 1 year from now. And for that certificate, Tara will be teaching a course on systems thinking. It's essentially a how-to on dissecting wicked conservation problems and working with diverse human stakeholder groups to develop solutions. So mark your calendars for that course next August. Many of the marine species and ecosystems that Dr. Whitty has studied are in dire straits. It would be easy to become despondent about their future, but Tara's work gives me hope. It is often said, we cannot manage marine resources. We can only manage humans. The first step toward that management is understanding. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Tara Whitty, who will present Let's Get Real, how to actually work with the human dimensions of conservation. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a very generous introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'm definitely still getting used to these hybrid presentations, and I really wish I could have been there in person, but maybe next time. I want to briefly say that Lisa, as an advisor, really exemplifies a lot of the traits I'm going to be talking about in terms of what conservation needs more of. And she did not tell you that she's the one who taught me about bycatch, which was really my my gateway into the work I do now. So for those of you who are interested in these things, I'd recommend Googling multiplier leaders, because that is exactly what Lisa was to me as a PhD advisor. So let's get real, how to actually work with the human dimensions of conservation. This is a new talk for me, and so I appreciate your patience as I kind of feel out some ideas, try out some slides I haven't worked with before. And you'll also notice some poaching of slides from my other presentations. The formatting will change, and then that's also just the reality of my time management right now. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. But how I came to where I am in terms of thinking about and working with the human dimensions of conservation is, as Lisa shared, I started with the behavioral ecology of charismatic animals, monkeys, zebras, songbirds, marine mammals, and then entered the world of marine megafauna, bycatch, and small-scale fisheries. And this picture, Lisa, you might recognize this from my PhD defense. Malampaya Sound in the Philippines was in many ways my thrown in the deep end learning grounds for the very complex context in which marine megafauna bycatch occurs, and indeed most conservation problems occur. And so that pushed me into learning more about social ecological systems, about human rights-based approaches to management and conservation, and about evaluating project pathways, what succeeds and what fails, and why. This is also where I entered the realm of small-scale fisheries researchers. And I'm sorry to say, natural scientists, they totally mock us when we say human dimensions. And I will get into a little bit why that is, and hopefully you will also come to see why it's a bit of a mismatch in terms of the reality of what conservation is. And then from there, my research and then later on my actual applied work moved toward evaluating projects and, excuse me, empowering local conservation and partnering with groups empowering local conservation through sharing of skills, working on inclusive governance, and sorry, and overall undergoing collaborative approaches. And this is what my consulting company, Keiruna Inc., mainly concerns itself with, and as Lisa mentioned, my podcast as well. And I do want to say that a lot of the critiques I share today might make me seem like a Debbie Downer, like I'm grumpy. The original name for this podcast was going to be Grumpy Lady Conservationist, and then I thought, okay, let's not make it seem like all my points are because I'm grumpy. These are valid points, regardless of my mental or emotional state. So I do want to say that the critiques I share today, the critiques I share in general, are with a view toward actually making conservation a more effective, ethical, and equitable field. And one reason why my time is particularly tight these days is my life shifted about 3 years ago when I decided to resign from my work with IUCN, my full-time work with IUCN, and move back home to be a communication partner to my non-speaking autistic brother. And it's been absolutely amazing. Non-speaking does not mean non-thinking. He and his peers are all some of the most brilliant people I've ever been around. Their bodies just didn't have an easy way to communicate. And I've entered, as his ally, more into the disability justice sphere. And it's really, really showed me a lot about marginalization, about inclusion, about power, and about affecting change. And many of these lessons translate very directly into conservation. So human dimensions of conservation, this is not a phrase I think that any of us are unfamiliar with. I've heard it in countless plenaries, seen it in so many talks, in titles of courses and programs, even in departments. And it paints this picture that conservation is, natural sciences, the animals and plants and the people who study them. And then there's some human stuff. There's human dimensions of all of that. And my question to you, and I know that this format makes it a little hard for it to be interactive, so if you want to pop it in the chat or just keep it in your head, what really are the non-human dimensions of conservation? And you could say aspects of the ecology or life history of an organism that's threatened. Sure, but why are we interested in that? Because there's a conservation threat, because it's an organism that we want to save. It comes down to us having that impact, making that judgment call, and acting to protect that organism, that species. So I don't think that's a question that gets asked a lot. What are the non-human dimensions of conservation, really? So for example, if we're looking at marine mammal bycatch and small-scale fisheries, here's some Irrawaddy dolphins, here's a small-scale fishing boat. That is, small-scale fishing bycatch is the main threat for this subpopulation, as it is for many others. If you're looking at it from this lens, you might think, okay, this is the proximate problem. These are the interaction between these two is what we have to deal with. But there's so much that is in that word, that phrase, small-scale fisheries. That represents communities, markets, and incentives. It represents how the fisheries are managed, how nature in the area is managed. It represents the well-being of the people in those communities. It represents rights and power in decision-making. It represents cultural values and so much more. And I also do want to say, because this is a new presentation for me in many ways, don't take these lists as being comprehensive. These are suggestive. And so instead of this, when we're thinking about the human dimensions of conservation as being kind of marginal, those of us who do work on the human stuff are kind of met with reactions like this. And I'm not exaggerating. These are definitely things that I've had to deal with in terms of people's reactions, whether explicit or kind of suggested to the work I do. Like, oh, cute, like stories from communities about things they've experienced. Now let's get to the real data. or, oh, well, this is all very kumbaya, all this inclusion stuff and caring about the communities. We need to get down to the business of saving species. And even, the point of view, like, if you don't like it, then leave. If you don't like how conservation's working, then get out of here. This hasn't been all of the reception that I've gotten, but it's definitely been there. And I'm not a particularly old researcher. I would say that these are things that have happened relatively recently. It also kind of manifests in human dimensions being marginalized in major conservation platforms like journals and like international conferences, like the Marine Mammal Conference, the Society for Marine Mammalogy Conference. I haven't been to one recently, partially because of this. The last one I went to in Barcelona, there was one human dimension session, one, despite pretty much every plenary saying that conservation is a human issue. And I had to fight to get my talk to be an oral presentation. At first, it was accepted as a speed presentation. And then I said, I know that what I'm sharing here is really, really relevant and important. Please give me a full talk. And they did. And I was one of 2 or maybe 3 talks in that whole session that were actually really about human dimensions and not kind of somewhat including human dimensions. So the really correct way of looking at this, in my opinion, is that conservation is entirely a human construct. We define it, we shape it. It's for us and our values, and we're the ones who decide how it moves forward. And of course, the necessity for it comes from our actions. Natural sciences is, of course, an important part of that. And I have it kind of off the orange rectangle a little bit to indicate, like, sure, there are aspects of the natural sciences, things you'll be studying that are not directly linked to what humans are doing. But again, the whole reason you're studying that in the context of conservation is because of what humans are doing. And so this is why small-scale fisheries researchers laugh at natural science conservation researchers when they say human dimensions of conservation. And so if we view conservation as only having human dimensions and not being entirely a human process, what we make room for is natural science privilege. So there's an emphasis on natural science research, which ignores a vast universe of research from different fields. And a lot of programs are very content to say, well, we do include economics, education, communications, marketing, political science, and law, and that's great. That is a great start, but unfortunately, a lot of programs stop there. What about anthropology, sociology, geography, psychology, history, even criminology? That's a new one that I recently met someone who does conservation criminology. And then research into fields of project management, facilitation, conflict resolution, organizational management, community organizing, human rights advocacy, innovation, and diffusion. That is where the conservation happens, my friends. And when we're focusing so much on natural sciences, it really doesn't make space for transdisciplinarity. And transdisciplinarity is kind of it's a solutions-oriented way of approaching a problem. And all these different disciplines with their very significant areas of expertise are, of course, important in the process, but they provide information for the process. They don't define the process, and they're brought together in an integrative approach that is based on collaboration and co-design with diverse stakeholders, really grounded in how do we translate this into a solution on the ground. And so if you're still content to say we do interdisciplinary work between, let's say, ecology and economics, I hope you can see how that is a much more limited approach than true transdisciplinarity. It also makes it easy for people to be complacent and kind of say, it's not my job. Like, I'm a natural scientist. It's not my job to make sure that my recommendations are usable. And it, once I went into management, once I joined IUCN full-time and was like frantically running projects, I kind of laughed whenever I read a paper that said, this is useful for managers, or this can inform managers. I was like, we don't have time to read papers. Papers are important, don't get me wrong. I feel that even when I was in academia, I really overestimated how useful papers are and academic findings. And we can debate whose responsibility it is to make those findings more useful and applicable and accessible. But the reality is that the role that that plays in actual conservation is much more limited than I certainly realized when I was an academic. Natural science privilege also leads to the precautionary principle only being applied to nature. And I completely understand, like there's a sense of urgency. We are losing species. And once you lose a species, you know, that's something irreplaceable. And this compels prompt action that, sure, it might err on the side of conservation. But we have to remember that this doesn't occur in the vacuum. Your options aren't, we did a little too much and invested a little too much in a species that was probably going to be okay, and we lost the species forever. The options also include, oh, we also accidentally caused irreparable damage to communities. We cause people to lose their livelihoods, and because of that, to face severe health issues, for example, or to have to migrate out of their communities, and then the whole social fabric of the community was torn. So precautionary principle, the alternative to taking that isn't a neutral nothing. There are negative impacts to communities. You can also invest in efforts that end up being counterproductive and harming future conservation, and of course, misallocation of precious resources. And with negative impacts to communities, when we say communities, I really wish that the conservation sector would remember more. Communities is human beings like you and me. They matter. And did they have a say in any of this? And here is a quote, and I'll reveal the source in a little bit. There is a fear of inaction and indifference on the tragic problems, but wrong actions are equally a danger, and they may create more indifference and disillusionment when they fail. And then with natural science privilege, there's the idea that natural scientists are the ultimate experts and heroes. I'm sure many of you in the room have been told by friends who are not in the field, oh, you're saving the planet, you're saving the ocean. We really need to remember that expertise in natural sciences does not necessarily mean you're an expert in knowing how to run conservation projects or organize movements or work with people or affect structural change. And that is exactly what conservation is. And also, I think a lot of experts can stand to realize that when we were in school for an inordinate number of years, other people weren't just out there twiddling their thumbs. They were having their own experiences and learning from those experiences and forming their own forms of knowledge and expertise. And so, you know, there's local ecological knowledge, there's community leaders and organizations, there's immersion, people who've been immersed in that real context of conservation. There's in the trenches work, like why don't we see more talks from rangers or managers and communities as well? And then other sectors working to help communities like public health or development or humanitarian aid. There's also this notion that natural scientists and their research is untainted by inconvenient human characteristics, like it's some sort of on this pedestal of neutrality. No, we are all humans with biases, emotions, and values that shape our research and also how we analyze and share that research. We're not neutral. We can and we do make mistakes. And it's this tricky balance. Expertise matters. Expertise isn't everything. And on that note, the quote I shared earlier is from this book, The Tyranny of Experts by William Easterly. And he was a senior research economist at the World Bank, but has since published multiple books on why international aid doesn't work and is in many ways deeply unethical. I so recommend this book for anyone. And full disclosure, I haven't managed to finish it because I frantically underline every other line in the book because it so resonates with me, even in a different field. And one of his main points is seeing poverty as a technical problem that calls for only technical solutions ignores the structural causes of poverty and the practical pathways to real solutions. And he argues there's not a shortage of expertise, there's a shortage of rights. And I think that this is completely in alignment with what's happening in conservation as well. He structures a lot of his book around the idea of technocrats or technocracy, which represents the uncritical transfer of the problems of society to the habits and thought of the natural science and engineer. Technocrats did not understand that institutions were complicated solutions to complex problems. They had evolved without expert guidance. Experts should have more humility in the face of traditions that they could not completely understand. So technocrats are generally external experts who come in with narrow expertise. It might be very deep expertise, but it's narrow. And they don't consider the history or local context or power and rights that occur that exist in a place. And he emphasizes there's no blank slate in anywhere we work, and there's no one size fits all. And another big idea is the idea of freedom. And there's another really fantastic book for anyone who's interested in this called Development as Freedom by Amartya Sen. And freedom is critically important. People having the rights to develop and choose from locally rooted solutions seems to be a very promising way forward for solutions that actually work and that actually are more respectful of human rights. And we have to get into the fact that when we privilege natural science, or really any academic field, we're really privileging views and voices from the global north. Natural sciences and academia in general, as a global community, is dominated by scientists from North America, Western Europe, and Australia due to availability for funding for key steps in the career, due to the dominance of the English language, due to structures, systems that still exist that were shaped by colonialism and racism, due to their greater access to education and training, and also really anemic efforts to meaningfully broaden access to more diverse experts, even trying to lower the cost of a conference that I will not name so that more folks from the global south could attend, were met by, well, it's really hard and it's expensive. And my friends from the global south were like, we realize that we still cannot attend this conference. Like, there needs to be more done to actually make things accessible. And so this is really a continuation of colonial mindsets, behaviors, and structures. And yes, conservation, of course, has a colonial history that continues. In many cases, it was used to control resources that the colonizers benefited from. And remember that controlling resources, no matter how good your intentions are, is still a form of power. So with natural science privilege, we see conservation as being rational. It's saving the planet. It's doing good. And what this engenders, I think, is a lack of humility, people being out of touch with people, conservationists being out of touch with reality, and the idea of moral licensing, which is like, I'm doing something good, so it's okay if I do some bad things in the process. It's similar to how expressions of overt racism actually in some sectors increased while President Obama was president, because people are like, oh, we have a Black president, so it's all good. I can go ahead and be racist in my everyday life now. And this has actually been studied. And I love arrested development. This is honestly how a lot of conservation organizations sound to me and to others in the field. I mean, it's one banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10? And so this leads to unethical and largely ineffective practices. So I'm going to shoot through some quick examples. The vaquita is perhaps not an example that needs a lot of introduction. Critically endangered porpoise, caught in bycatch in local fisheries, local shrimp fisheries, and illegal fisheries for the totoaba, from which the swim bladder is very valued and can sell for very high prices. And as a note, I studied this in 2016, so my perspective might be a bit outdated. The idealized pathway as envisioned by conservationists was they'd go through this process of decision making, they'd ban the gill nets, the shrimp and the totoaba ones, strengthen enforcement, provide compensation for fishers, and alternative gear to minimize the negative impact on communities, thus getting gear out of the water, including the illegal totoaba nets, and at the same time fostering community compliance and support, thus eliminating bycatch. Of course, what happened was that bycatch continued. And so through interviews with stakeholders, my team and I kind of looked at what happened along the way. Strengthening and enforcement didn't happen to the extent that was anticipated compensation, totally inequitable, totally ineffective. The program wasn't even fully up and running when I was doing research there a year after the ban. The alternative gear was not accepted by communities because a lot of them hadn't been involved in planning it. So there were significant negative impacts to communities. The local food bank there told me that they saw such an uptick in people needing support just for their day-to-day food. So of course, you're going to have lower community compliance and support. Some people were actually switching to illegal totawaba fisheries to make a better living. And so that planned pathway, most of it didn't actually happen. And in a more kind of abstract way, I think natural scientists as conservationists tend to think of, oops, sorry, I went too far ahead. So what actually happened was that in the decision-making process, there was a history of conflict between the communities and conservationists over decades. This was not addressed. There was no attempt to make people, to help people get on the same page again. And so I already went over all of this, but basically the underlying conflict was worsened through this process, which actually makes it harder in the future for conservation in the area to happen. And so as natural scientists, I think a lot of times we think of this in a very rational way. We'll make some decisions, there's a conservation action, it'll lead to some outcome. What we often don't think about is, okay, what is included in that planning and decision-making process that will help us be sensitive to conflict and social needs? What are we doing in this conservation action to avoid or mitigate negative social impacts? And where those happen, that's going to exacerbate any underlying conflict, creating resentment and resistance, which is actually going to make it harder to reach your conservation goals. So this is something that I call counterproductive conservation pathways. On a similar note, I won't go through all of this, but in 2016, I was called into a meeting at Scripps with some other conservation experts, and we had this proposition basically that this conservation group wanted to set aside these seamounts off the coast through the Antiquities Act of 1906 while Obama was still in office as a way of bypassing standard stakeholder consultations to designate protected areas. I was the only one in the room who was horrified by this. Everyone else was like, that sounds great. Let's bypass that consultation process and get this area protected. And sure enough, some months later, there was resistance from the fishing sector and from the local fishing sector. And there is a session kind of held at CNBC to discuss this. And basically a group of fishers had come together to write a letter protesting, like 40 fishing groups, as you can see here, protesting this proposed step. And they highlight here that unilateral action under the Antiquities Act would also contradict the fully public and transparent processes that currently exist under the federal Magnuson-Stevens Act. And so when I was at that seminar with representatives from the fishing industry and the conservationists, I asked the fishers if the conservation group had come to you and said, we want to partner to protect these seamounts against oil and gas exploration, for example, would you have partnered with them? And the fishers said, we would have been happy to partner with them. We don't want that stuff happening there anyway, but they went ahead and did this and we don't want to work with them anymore. And then the Ridge to Reef project in Myanmar, which was supposed to be this integrated protected area land and seascape management in the region of Tenantari in southern Myanmar. And the write-up on it says the overall project approach entails consultation and engagement of all villages in the project area. And as someone who is privy to what actually happened, this is totally not true. This didn't happen. And some context, Myanmar was colonized by the British, and the British implemented systems of control and oppression, which are still used by the authoritarian military regime, which has recently, well, 2 years ago, launched a coup and again, ruling the country in an authoritarian way. The large conservation NGOs who have been operating in Myanmar for decades, obviously they must have had the approval of this military government. How does a large international organization function in a country that's pretty much otherwise closed internationally? Well, in many parts of Myanmar, these big organizations and the protected areas they they work to implement are seen as land grabbing on behalf of the military government. So they're really not welcomed in a lot of Myanmar, and this is particularly pronounced for terrestrial conservation. So I'm going to skip through these. Sorry. The free, prior, and informed consent process, which is the process by which communities are told, hey, this is what we want to do. You're under no duress to give us permission. Here's the full information of what we're planning. Do we have your consent? That was really rushed through by a foreign consultant. And so thankfully, there's a very strong consortium of local and indigenous conservation groups there who filed a formal complaint with the Global Environment Fund, which is the funder, referencing their international rights that were being violated, and the project has been put on hold. And I see this as a great success, and I really recommend learning more about these groups. They have some great resources online. So a lot of the things that went wrong with these examples, again, is not realizing that conservation is a human construct. And it's a human construct in multiple layers or dimensions or planes. The simple view would be the social ecological context. So you have the interaction between the fishers and the dolphins and bycatch, for example, and whatever's going with the ecosystem or habitat. And then you have the drivers, what is the context in which those fishers live? Why are they fishing? What are their needs? You have other uses of the space for recreation or research. You have other extractive uses. You have industrial fishing, perhaps factories or mining, which have their own environmental impacts as well as social impacts. You have governance, often in a fairly remote provincial or urban area with policies and laws, also corruption. You have international conservation groups and local ones. Then you have really large scale issues like climate change and global markets. I'm not going to draw arrows because it would all look like this. And when we approach this system, trying to fix one part of it, it's like trying to untangle a big mess like that by just pulling at one string and not really seeing how it's intertwined with other strings. You might end up making the tangle worse. And so again, conservation is a human construct. And there's that social ecological context layer. But things that I've been working with and thinking about more recently than that, the second layer is kind of humans conceptualize conservation. They define conservation based on human values, which are influenced by any number of things: our needs, how we benefit from nature, what our history is, what our culture is, what our identities are. And this shapes our decisions around what should be safe, what's worthwhile, what is good. Do we want it for function or for its intrinsic value? What and who are we saving it for? And what measures are acceptable? And then the third layer is the dynamics and interactions of the actual logistics of implementation. And this is where we really need to think about who and how. And these questions interact with the ideas of the overall system of conservation, who has power in it, the resources that fuel that power, and the processes in which that power kind of interacts. So who defines and maintains the system, and how is the system maintained or changed, and on what timescales? In terms of power, who has the power to decide? Who has rights? Whose rights are recognized? Who matters? What are the inequalities in that power? And what are conflicts between those conflicts rooted in those inequalities in power, both past, because people remember things, and present? And to support power, what are the skills that are needed? What kind of awareness is needed? What's the funding to support the sharing of those skills and awareness? And then in kind of more cut and dry terms, who actually is able to get permits? Who's able to get equipment and supplies? And then the interactions around all of these is who and is involved, and how are these processes undertaken? The design and planning of conservation, the notion of inclusion, communications around conservation, decision-making, allocation of resources, funds, power, rights, recognition, and respect. And please don't underestimate how important respect is. That is a huge piece in why a lot of marginalized groups feel further marginalized in processes such as conservation, is they don't feel like they get enough respect. And some brief examples, I evaluated the process of locally managed marine area establishment in Myanmar in the Miik Archipelago, and it was a community-driven process. The issue was that there is an indigenous group there, the Moken, who you might have heard of. They don't speak the same language that's dominant in these communities. They live literally on the margins of the communities, and they have historically been marginalized. And so even though they were invited to information sessions, consultations, workshops, they did not feel comfortable going. And when we interviewed them, there's only one member of my team, Yin Yin, she's amazing with communities. She was the only one they felt comfortable talking to. The rest of us had to make ourselves scarce. And so when we think about inclusion, we really need to be actively thinking about what that looks like in a way that's meaningful. And how do we facilitate that? It's not enough to send invitations out. Another interesting example of kind of these many layers is the blue economy impacts on coastal communities. Blue economy means different things to different people. Unfortunately, in many countries, the way it's been manifested is in promoting market chains rooted in marine coastal resources in a way that leads to increased privatization of those resources. So you might say, oh yeah, like our aquaculture sector really had a big boost this year, except that was in the form of major companies that then blocked off coastal access to communities who needed that access, to mangrove forests, for example, for their own resources, to fishing grounds, for example. And so blue economy in the communities that I interviewed in India and Bangladesh and even parts of Thailand is really synonymous with evil. And so we might have these kind of higher level ideas that sound great on a global scale when you're talking to people in suits in English. And then when it comes down to how it's actually going to manifest in reality, it's going to be a very different picture with very serious impact. In my work in the Gulf of Matama project in Myanmar, one way we evaluated the project was a participatory qualitative evaluation form where the communities get to tell us what they want us to evaluate the project on, and they share with us their own stories about how the project has or hasn't impacted them in those ways. And one thing that was really great was the most resonant things that they mentioned, in addition to a lot of great things that the project did, was that they felt more confident in managing their livelihoods, in managing their resources, and communicating and collaborating with each other. And then empowering women in conservation, I got to do this really cool project interviewing grantees from the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund in the Indo-Burma hotspot, and how these small organizations were able to make concrete steps to better include women in conservation processes. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing now. I do want to highlight the example of, oh my goodness, I don't remember what MCI stands for, I'm sorry. MCI Thailand. They trained women in participatory action research. And so basically the women were the researchers. They led the data, they shaped the data agenda. MCI supported them in terms of printing books and accessing platforms, but they made it very clear to the women, this is your knowledge, this is your power. You're just the ones to help record and summarize it. And there's many powerful examples. This is a toolkit, a presentation that's available online through CEPF. And yes, I made it, but I'm very happy with how it turned out. So I would encourage checking it out. Another thing to consider in amplifying women's voices or the voices of anyone who's been excluded is they're going to need a little extra support if this is something that they haven't been used to doing. No one's going to immediately be good at public speaking if they have been expected to maintain the household their whole lives, right? And just because they're not immediately successful at it doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity to be. So mindful facilitation of access and skills is such an important skill that will equip the people you work with things that really nothing can take away. The political changes, economic changes, whatever, they're still going to remember that feeling of confidence. They're still going to remember those skills. And so that's really powerful in terms of sustaining meaningful conservation impact. Layers of humanity and conservation that really all need to be considered in concert. There's the notions these two notions of safeguards and monitoring and evaluation that I want to briefly mention because they are important and they're a great step in the right direction. So I referenced that the precautionary principle is generally only used toward nature. Well, environmental and social safeguards are trying to help broaden what we're precautionary toward. And so many organizations and donors will require that your projects involve reporting on anticipated and possible social and environmental impacts, as well as unintended ones. And sometimes this is linked to a grievance mechanism, as that example in Tanantari, Myanmar, when they could complain to the donor. This also goes hand in hand with a principle called do no harm, which is really common in a lot of development and aid organizations, is that your project should not make things worse. Monitoring and evaluation is kind of the flip side of that, where like you have the safeguards in place, like we think these might be risks, this is how we'll handle them. Monitoring and evaluation is actually seeing what came to pass. And this can be done for environmental and social impacts, but it's much less extensive in the social side of things, and it's not nearly extensive enough for either. And this can be conducted for various purposes. The issue is that both of these take time, energy, and resources and expertise, but they're treated as an afterthought or boxes to be checked as an inconvenience. And being candid, when I was running projects and had to do safeguards, even I was like, oh my God, this is so annoying. And it's because I had no time allocated to me in the project cycle for doing that. Even though I, as a human being, resonate with how important they are, me as someone actually like doing my job didn't have the space to treat it with the care that it really needs. And they're not yet fully integrated into feedback, reporting, accountability, and adaptation processes. So they're on their way, but a lot of improvements need to be made. So the challenges and barriers that we encounter when we're trying to really meaningfully acknowledge and work with the acknowledgement that conservation is a human construct is that humans are messy. Our interactions are messy. They take time, they take resources to evolve and change. And time and resources are limited in projects and initiatives. They require certain kinds of expertise that currently are not integrated into conservation processes. They are certainly very sensitive to social political contexts. For example, the project I worked on in Myanmar really had to rethink, re-strategize following the coup. And then, of course, there's that sense of urgency. And kind of cross-cutting all of these is that the funding and processes and timelines are way too restrictive. There's a lack of transparency and accountability in the process, and there's a lot of ingrained mindsets. But ways forward include better funding models, better project structures that are more flexible and align with the reality of humanity, truly inclusive spaces, transdisciplinarity, real co-design, sustainable empowerment, and underlying all of those are ideas of access, autonomy, and agency, then empathy, humility, and accountability, and a link to reality. And I'll just touch on these three. I am running a little bit low on time, but I hope to make it through. So better funding models, and this is something that I've known is needed for a long time, especially when I was part of IUCN trying to manage budgets. But I've seen some really interesting work coming out recently about notions of co-design in philanthropy. So this paper by Enrici et al. Covers the Packard Foundation and how the Packard Foundation is a bit unusual in engaging in co-development of their projects. There's this notion of social justice philanthropy where you have the next gen donors, a younger generation of donors who are more interested in challenging structures and systems with their privilege and money. Then there's trust-based philanthropy, and these are not mutually exclusive, but it's basically donors cultivating a relationship with who they're funding and not requiring a lot of very rigid reports or restrictions on what can be funded. Of course, there needs to be accountability, but making it more flexible, and that is something that will really help with that messiness, with that need to be flexible with timelines and resources. There's also the rise in decentralized crowdfunding. So Key Conservation is an app that's pretty exciting. I encourage you all to check it out. And then mutual aid, which is more resource sharing than funding, but there's a group at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice, and they've engaged in using their privilege as researchers with expertise and access to equipment to do research that Indigenous communities ask them to conduct. So these are very encouraging models. And I also recommend checking out Unorthodox's ongoing project, The Future of Philanthropy for Biodiversity. Then there's a notion of true co-design. As someone who sat on grant panels for proposals on designing conservation or management, I really was shocked how many researchers seem to think that sharing information and consultation and doing a workshop is co-design. It's not. True co-design starts at the conception of a project and it's incorporated throughout. Again, this is hard in the current project cycle and funding structure, but you should try to integrate it as early in the process as possible. And key terms that might be related to this are design thinking and human-centered design and research. And so design thinking is something that I'm really excited about. Some of my collaborators have worked on it. A lot of my best young mentees have training in design thinking. And you might see a lot of similarity with the notion of transdisciplinarity. It's solutions focused, it's inherently transdisciplinary and collaborative. It doesn't really care where the information comes from. It identifies what information is needed and then goes out and seeks it in the appropriate manner. There's the idea of failing fast forward, like try things out, test them out. If they don't work, fix them, keep going forward. Whereas I think in conservation, we have fail quietly and slowly, unfortunately. It really values creativity, which I think is really needed for the complex problems we have in conservation. And it's grounded in the target user, the human's reality. And then from my experience as an ally to my brother in his advocacy for non-speakers, and this also applies more broadly to disability justice and social justice in general, there are these notions of these kind of central tenets. Access. People need access to needed supports to live a fulfilling life, to the skills they needed, to the resource they need, and to the platforms they need. Agency is being able to exercise your rights and to shape processes. So this is something that a lot of disabled people are denied, right? And autonomy, it's not the same as independence. There's a lot of interdependence. You can still depend on other people, but having autonomy means that you can shape and act what you do based on your own values and interests. And so if you're working to support inclusion and diversity as a true ally, you need to work for these 3 A's. You need to operate under the assumption that the skills you provide, the awareness you provide, the people you're working with might take it in a different direction than you would like, but that's their agency. And I just want to close by saying we don't need no more papers on the importance of inclusion in leadership, especially not from natural scientists, sorry. We need to co-design, practice, evaluate, and adapt better ways of working that actively cultivate and support inclusion and leadership. And you could say the same about inclusion, leadership, any other topic that researchers like to put in papers, but that's kind of common sense, and we have enough papers showing that already. And then I kind of want to gently challenge you to think, what are you doing to work with the humanity in conservation? And I understand long-term systemic change is tough. There is certainly a role for pure research, but if we're working in conservation and accepting praise that we're saving the world, I feel like there's perhaps an obligation to take at least short-term but still meaningful steps, which are easier than you might think. In Myanmar, I had faculty members that are clamoring to learn Excel from me. You know, I mean, it was a great way to get rid of my imposter syndrome, just knowing that the training we have, and I'm making assumptions about those of you in the audience, the training we have is a huge privilege. We put a lot of work into it. It's worthwhile. It's worth a lot to people who did not have that privilege. And so there are concrete things you can do. You can volunteer to give a seminar or a training or a workshop remotely to small conservation organizations, for example. You can be mindful of how your own projects, how your own labs, how your own events are decolonizing access, are actually being more active to be inclusive. there's a lot that can be done that is feasible in the near term. I know I went a little long. That was my first time running through this. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you again, Lisa, for the kind introduction. Thank you, everyone who worked to make this hybrid setup possible. And if there's still time for questions, I would be thrilled to take them. Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and just pull you up. We'll do.
Should I stop share?
Yeah. And let's pull. There we go. And we'll open this up to questions. Folks in the audience, raise your hand. I'll turn on the light so I can see you. And first question, of course.
Hi, Tara. It's Lisa. Thank you so much. Incredible seminar. Very thought-provoking. As I was sitting here near the end of your talk trying to frame my question, you ended showing me how to move forward with this question. I'm struck repeatedly, and this is why I'm so intrigued by what you do now. And it's a driver for a lot of what I try to do up here, is that regardless of what you think about the value of human dimensions, if you don't do it, I'm convinced that your conservation efforts will fail. And vaquita is a perfect example of that, as you showed us. So, yet many of us continue to be ignorant about how you might even begin to incorporate all of those additional dimensions that you spoke about associated with any conservation problem. So for example, I'm a classically trained ecologist, and I wouldn't know the first thing about how to go about creating a team to address a conservation problem. At the very end of your talk, you said, well, take simple steps and they are meaningful. So I guess my question to you is, I have a small skill set that's relevant to, let's say, trying to keep vaquita from going extinct, but it needs a lot of other skill sets that would form truly a transdisciplinary team, people with expertise that I wouldn't even know how to communicate with. That's a real roadblock for me. And what are your thoughts about how one might go forward in trying to build that team?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lisa. And the vaquita isn't the example I was referring to when I had a natural scientist researcher tell me, it's not my responsibility to make sure that people's livelihoods are protected. That's not my job. And I think that there are structural obstacles. You know, universities haven't and still maybe don't make it the easiest to conduct work in a truly interdisciplinary way. Same thing with funding structures. But I do think that, and not speaking on your behalf at all, Lisa, I feel like the roadblocks that people feel about this don't do those people justice, right? Like the people working in the natural sciences are very smart. You know, they've figured out how to make things work in the context of their own research, of the institutions where they work. And so I think that people tend to get in their own heads just because this is something that's unfamiliar. And so I do want to again say that it's not as hard as people might think, structural issues aside, to forge these connections. So at universities, there's this great gift that you have many departments, and whether or not they're able to share funding easily is a different thing. But also I would start with where your study site is, where your conservation site is. Are there groups there working already on human rights, on livelihoods, on tourism? Being creative and casting a broad net, and then maybe oh, okay, it would be really helpful to have someone who knows about livelihood development. It would be really helpful to have someone who knows about human rights issues or communications. And so I do think that with creative networking that there are solutions out there. It just kind of takes that initial confidence to try. So I know that's not the best answer, but I will say that it's if we are, as natural scientists, lobbying for something to change in a way that will have significant ramifications for other people, in a way that will only be properly done with these external partnerships or with these transdisciplinary partnerships, it kind of is your obligation to make sure that this happens. Sorry, Lisa, I feel like I'm rambling, but I would say there's always people who know people who know people. And I'd say people who work in actual nonprofits, even the big international ones who certainly make a lot of missteps, they are savvy about these other organizations. I mean, they often do work funded by USAID, which funds other kinds of work as well. So I think learning from colleagues who are practitioners, I think trying to connect with local organizations is really huge. I think they're a lot more agile and flexible and responsive to local needs. Yeah, I think just networking is really important. I feel very dissatisfied with that answer, but I hope it sheds some light on your question.
Any other questions in the room?
Another question really, but I just wanted to say also thanks for your amazing talk. And I think that the message that your presentation had and the message that you had for us is one of the most important ones that we had presented here in the last years. And I think that, should concern all of us. So thanks so much.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that.
I'm a bit hesitant to do this, but I just want to first point out and thank you so much for being here, because we've had a real privilege here. We actually had a talk a few weeks ago by, I think, Lisa's advisor. And now you come here having been advised by Lisa.
Oh, that's nice.
And I asked a question of Lisa's advisor that I don't think was very well asked. And I want to ask you the same question, because I really liked a central point of what you communicated to us is that conservation is a human construct. But I was asking Lisa's advisor whether, because he's been studying this kind of thing for 45 years or something, whether he knew any examples of where he had observed a conservation type action motivated by a non-human entity. And I want to ask you to think about that, because I think there are actually examples of creatures that are very good at conserving the sorts of things they need to survive. I mean, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, Lisa. Who's your Barrett asked me, so what did I think? And I didn't have anything to say, but today I have a suggestion that maybe creatures that we think of as rather simple, but although they have very complicated social organizations, things like ants.
Yeah.
I think they are very good conservationists. And I think that may modify your central communication as you go forward. I don't know.
I appreciate that point. I actually had a fun discussion about this with my friend earlier today when he asked me what I was doing today. I completely appreciate your point. I wouldn't say that it changes the way I'm framing this talk, because as we understand conservation and as we engage in conservation, the things that concern us, they are still human. So what ants or other organisms might do to maintain their own resources, it's kind of outside of that system. And once we become concerned about preserving those, then it actually does become a human thing because we are involved. So maybe I could include a small disclaimer that this does not include resource management undertaken by other species. But as we kind of functionally understand it and engage with it, I would still say that conservation under that definition is still a human construct. But thank you for that food for thought. I enjoyed that.
All right. Do we have any questions online? Nope. Any more questions? Oh, we have one question up at the top.
Hi, thank you so much for your time and for this wonderful talk. I wanted to ask a question on behalf of young scientists and scientists who are starting out, who are striving towards transdisciplinary co-designs. How do we begin doing that when we feel that there's a lack of resource or like there's no path set?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I'm sensitive, having been a student in a university myself, to the constraints that the university setting, that requirements, that administration and access to funding, the constraints that those pose. It's kind of similar to my answer to Lisa, as rambling and unsatisfying as it was. I would first start with challenging yourself to think outside of the box and actually engaging in your own process of design thinking. Like, okay, if I want to engage in this process of co-design, what needs to happen? And not letting reality get in the way at the beginning stage, like throwing as many ideas as you can out there to stimulate that creativity and then honing it down. And I think that there's a lot that can be gained from contacting groups that specialize in design thinking or co-design. A lot of my work was really informed by Point B Design and Training, which is a design thinking lab based in Myanmar, for example. I think that there are people hidden in the nooks and crannies of different universities who do this kind of work, including at OSU. And I'm really embarrassed that I'm forgetting their names, but Lisa, the people who we met with when we were formulating this course for next year, had some really informative thoughts around that. And it's also worthwhile, and I don't know what your situation is, looking for funding for grants that are explicitly looking for co-design. More and more funding sources are interested in that, and maybe they're just interested in it as a buzzword, but if you can show that you are actually committed to engaging in it, I think that would be very advantageous. And you might be limited in the extent to which you can incorporate co-design in your work. It's really difficult to say we're going to totally co-design this whole project because funders want to see what you're going to do before you have a chance to engage with people, right? So try to build in those co-design checks along the way. Like, this is what I plan to do. Here are points where, based on my collaborators, my community collaborators and their feedback, where we might need to change some things. And I also think, again, networking has been so important to me in my work. It's something I stress with all of my mentees. Make connections with people doing interesting work, even if it's outside your area of expertise. If you're interested in working in a country, especially if you're interested in working in another country or a community that you're not part of, starting to foster those connections, and not just seeing it as this is a connection for this project, but this is potentially a career-long, lifelong, or at least several years long connection, will continually benefit the work that you're doing along the lines of co-design. Yeah, again, I wish I had a more pithy answer. Maybe if I think about it for 20 more minutes, I'd come up with something better. But I think those are some good ideas to start with.
All right. Thank you. And with that, I think we should end our seminar. Please join me in thanking our speaker.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure, and thank you for all the interesting questions.
Thank you. Thank you. And please sign out if you didn't sign in. And again, this is a recorded seminar, so it will be available on our past seminar page. Thank you all for joining us online and in person.